Welcome to the R.E. podcast, the first dedicated R.E. podcast for students and teachers. The one with the Catholic. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the R.E. podcast, the podcast for those of you who think R.E. is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. This week, I am joined by Dr. Mary Shanahan to talk about her life as a Catholic in the 21st century. Welcome, Mary. It's so lovely to have you on the R.E. podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to have been invited, and I'm really looking forward to chatting to you.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to chatting to you too. So let's start with a little bit about you. So what can you tell me about yourself?
Well, I suppose I was born in Ireland into a Catholic family in the beautiful 1980s, which is when many of the best people were made. And my family and I then emigrated to England when I was 6. So we spent 10 years there, and I attended Church of England schools when we lived in England, which was a fascinating experience. Then we moved back to Ireland when I was 16, and I went to a multi-denominational school then. Then after college, it was for me to become a religious education and English teacher in the beautiful Mater Dei Institute. And I then went on to postgrad studies in UCD to study philosophy to doctoral level, and eventually found my way into lecturing. And I am now the Director of Religious Education in St Angela's College in Sligo, where I mainly work with student religious education teachers.
Well, that's quite impressive. Can I ask you why R.E. and what was it about it that attracted you to the subject?
I suppose at the very, very early stages of my life as a child, my dad was just a brilliant person really to be around. He still is. He's still with us, thankfully. And he would always kind of say prayers with me at night and just, bring us to mass. And, he was just a very positive influence in that way. And then when I lived in England, I did religious education for my GCSEs. And I had 2 incredible religious education teachers, Mr. Jones and Mrs. Haynes in Myton School in Warwick. So if they're still listening, hello to you. They were incredible, and they just, I suppose they lit a fire under me for this subject, and the sheer amount of questions it addresses, and there's just so many ways to come at things in RE. And then when we moved to Ireland, my experience of religious education was a little different because it wasn't then an exam subject. It is now, so it was quite different. And then off I went to college, and I was unsure about whether I was going to be a good religious education teacher. I went to become an English and religious education teacher, and then at college it just got better and better and better, and I just couldn't get enough of the subject. And here I still am talking about it. So, I just love it.
Absolutely. And I feel exactly the same way after 20 years of doing it. It's an absolute privilege and an honour to have that job, I think. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about your Catholic faith. What is it about Catholicism that really appeals to you?
It's a really good question, and I've thought long and hard about this before speaking to you because, it's the sort of thing when you're very familiar with the faith and it's been yours since birth, you often don't think lots about why it matters to you. I suppose really those core gospel values of love of neighbour, care for the marginalised, compassion and kindness just, to me, still seem to be very, very important. And there's an incredibly strong sense of community amongst Catholics, I would say, particularly lay Catholics, so that for your listeners, that's Catholics who aren't ordained, who aren't priests. So there's a strong community, and I think the idea of forgiveness being something that is open to everyone is a really beautiful idea, and I value that very, very much.
Absolutely. What a beautiful answer. And I think especially right now in the situation we face, we're understanding why community is so important when it's been taken away from us for the majority of this year. Mm-hmm. And anyone that is a regular listener to the podcast knows how much I value kindness. And as I get older, seems to be the most important thing that we can be is kind to others. So yes, thank you for the answer. How do you think Catholicism differs from other religions or other denominations?
That's another really good question. And I suppose it's something I explore quite a bit with my students, because I would find that in Ireland, the majority of the population still identify as Catholic. Now, many would, I suppose, define themselves as cultural Catholics. And I found that on the ground, at least, there didn't appear to be a huge understanding of different denominations or different religions in the part of Ireland that I moved to. And even now, the students who I teach have a lot to learn still about different traditions and denominations. The main, I suppose, difference, if you like, between Catholicism and, say, for example, Protestant Christian denominations very much comes down to number of sacraments. So, Catholics would have 7 and Protestant denominations tend to have 2. There are some differences in our interpretations of the Bible and our approach to the Bible. The position of Mary and how we view her is not the same across all of the different Christian denominations. In terms of other religions, then, I suppose if you look at something like Judaism, for Jews, the Messiah is yet to come, and we Catholic Christians say that he came and is the Christ. For Muslims, there's a really fascinating perspective on Jesus as a prophet. And obviously that's not quite the same as how Catholics would view Jesus. But to me, it always has struck me as incredibly interesting that this other major tradition has this view. And then if you look at something like Buddhism, the idea of God is much less important compared to something like personal responsibility. So I've gone on a bit there, but I think a lot about these things.
No, and I think this is what's lovely about being an RE teacher and being able to teach about different religions, is you see these connections between all faiths, and it brings us together and unites us. What difference do you think being a Catholic makes to your life?
I'm not sure how I would conceive of my life as not a Catholic, because again, I've been one my whole life, and it hasn't always been an easy relationship for me, my relationship with my faith. But I suppose the way I view the world is very, very much impacted by my faith and by my formation as a Catholic. We've spoken a little bit about kindness, and it's often dismissed or batted away as if that's a childish notion, but actually there's a real depth to proper human kindness in that sense of compassion. So I think that when I am talking to other people, I try to be as compassionate as possible, and I try to be as understanding and tolerant. And I think that's because from childhood, my understanding of Jesus was as somebody who was there to try to reach out to everybody and to try to understand everyone, even if you don't necessarily agree with them. And I suppose that kind of childish sense of Jesus has grown as I've grown. And yet this notion of compassion and reaching out to others is there. And I very much would root that in my Catholic faith.
And I think I absolutely agree with you. The one thing that I admire and love about the person of Jesus is his compassion for people that others reject or others don't see the value in. I think that's an inspiration for all humans. You mentioned there that you've had some times where you've had a difficult relationship with your faith. Can you talk us through what you think the hardest thing is about being a Catholic?
I'll try. I suppose the first thing I would say is that sometimes, being a Catholic in one country is not quite the same as being Catholic in another country. So Irish Catholicism, in my own experience, and I've only lived in 2 countries, so I'm hardly a globetrotter, but it is not the same as perhaps English Catholicism in lots of ways. In Ireland, I would say one of the hardest things about being a Catholic is the reality of the abuse scandals and the horrors of it. And when a lot of that, I suppose, came to light, it was kind of the early 2000s, a lot of the sheer magnitude of what had happened came to light. I was a student teacher, and for a time I thought about leaving my college. I thought that I can't represent this. I thought about leaving my faith, and I really, really had to think long and hard. And as the years have gone on and different things have emerged, such as the mother and baby homes scandals, again, you come back to, is this what I'm saying I accept? Is this what I'm saying I endorse if I say I'm a Catholic? And the answer is it's not. I come back to the message of Christ, the beginnings of the church, and what the gospel is about. And I think that what has happened at times is that there has been a confusion, I think, with Catholicism and equating that with the hierarchy, and forgetting that actually Catholicism exists because of the millions of Catholics around the world. It is not simply this group of selected men in Rome making decisions that have had horrendous impacts and unforgivable impacts on the lives of so many. That those are the issues that challenge me most, the things that I suppose I get asked about a lot and I talk about a lot. But I come back to the gospel message, and I believe in the truth of the gospel message. And that is why I retain my Catholic faith. I accept the 7 sacraments. I really, really place a lot of emphasis, I suppose, on how we Catholics view Mary. And I think there's a real beauty in that, this idea of a mother and child relationship. So that's why I continue to be a Catholic. But the challenges are real. And I think any Catholic worth their salt cannot deny just the reality of what has happened and the absolute horror of it.
So we're just going to have a quick word from our sponsors. Hello, I'm Randy Duncan, and I invite you to join me on my verse-by-verse Bible study podcast where I go through the Bible verse by verse. But if you're looking for just a quick life lesson Bible study, then this is not the podcast for you. This isn't your Sunday school coloring book type of Bible study. This is a deeper dive Bible study designed to help you grow in your knowledge and understanding of the Bible and ultimately in your relationship with God. And so again, I invite you to take a listen to my verse-by-verse Bible study with Randy Duncan. And even if mine isn't the one for you, I pray you'll find a Christian podcast that does resonate with you and will help you deepen your relationship and faith in Jesus Christ.
I think you're absolutely wise to separate your Catholic faith and the faith of millions of Catholics around the world and what the Catholic Church as an institution has been responsible for. And I think the abuse scandal is a challenge for all of us as humans. And we have to all ask ourselves questions about what humans are capable of. Do you think enough has been done?
Absolutely not. No. And I would say that a great many of my friends, some of my friends are Catholic, some aren't, some are very Orthodox Catholic, some are much more liberal than me. We are all united on that particular issue. So, I have friends in America who would be, conservative Catholics to a certain extent who are just horrified by what has happened and spoken out about it. And then I have, friends who I suppose like me occupy maybe a little bit more of a moderate position. No, I don't think enough has been done. And I think, again, we're back to this, the institution and the people. There should be unity between the two, and yet there isn't. And that's not to say that every ordained member of the church or every leader in the church is corrupt, because they are absolutely not. I know personally some fantastic people who are bishops and priests and nuns, really fantastic people. But clearly something has gone very, very, very wrong. And I think we have to listen to the victims. And the victims are repeatedly telling us over and over again that they are not being listened to, that enough has not been done, that they do not feel the apologies are meaningful. And I'm sorry, but, when someone is a victim, they're the person you listen to. The perpetrator does not get to say, well, I've said sorry enough times and that's that.
Yes.
Certainly not for me anyway. That's not how it works.
No. And as you said, we talked about compassion, that the most compassionate thing is to listen to the victims of this awful abuse. Do you think maybe a starting point would be to consider the role of celibacy for Catholic priests? And maybe we're in a situation now where the Catholic Church needs to revisit that conversation.
I have two main thoughts on that. The one is that I'm not sure that it is celibacy that brought about the abuse scandal. I'm not so sure that we can equate celibacy with the horrendous abuse of children. So that's the one thing I would insert as a proviso. On the celibacy issue, however, within the Catholic Church, it's not until the 1100s that celibacy actually becomes a rule. So up until, I think it's the Second Lateran Council, there were priests who were married. It was kind of a mixture. And then from then on, the rule comes in that priests may not marry. And then I suppose as kind of a reaction to the Reformation at the Council of Trent, that rule got really strongly underlined. And really ever since then, it's been a very hard and fast rule. And I've never fully understood why that must be the case. I understand that for some people, they may feel very much called to a celibate life. And for them, that's their way of expressing their faith. And I think you should be free to do that if that's what you choose. But I do not see how a priest having a family could be harmful. Maybe part of it is, my best friend when I was at school in England was a vicar's daughter. So I spent a lot of time at their house, chatting to her mum and dad and her brother and her. And, I saw priesthood within a family environment. And it didn't seem to be a terrible thing. It was challenging for them, obviously, at times. And I suppose financially for the church, it would be expensive. But I don't think allowing priests the option to either be celibate or marry is going to kind of mean that there's suddenly going to be millions of people who want to become priests. I think it would be wise, and I think there are a lot of priests who would really welcome it. But I don't think we can say that celibacy is at the root of what happened with the abuse scandals. I don't think we can say that removing that rule would mean there would never be any again. I think we have to be kind of careful there on that ground.
Fabulous. Thank you for that answer. I think that's very wise. How do you feel about maybe the Catholic Church allowing women priests? Obviously in the 21st century, we are focusing a lot on gender equality. Is that something that you feel would be a positive change for the Catholic Church?
Yes, I do. I can remember being really young and asking my dad, why are only men priests? The poor man had so many questions from me as a child. I can't remember even what he said. it confused me for a long time. You know, I remember going to college and some of my friends felt, you know, no, there's no need for women to become priests. And some of my friends did. And we would ask our lecturers, you know, what are the arguments? Give us a reason for why, you know, this must be the case. And I've never heard an argument in relation to male-only priesthood that has persuaded me. You know, and then if you add that to the fact that we have documented proof that in the early church, women did occupy leadership positions. You know, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he names out Phoebe as a deacon. You know, you're kind of left going, what happened? What changed? And why did it change? I know so many women who are fantastic leaders, and I certainly have known women theologians who I think would make brilliant priests. Now, I've never felt that call myself. But again, I don't understand the resistance. And I would say again that, you know, on the ground amongst the Catholic laity, it's a very kind of divisive issue. And I would also say that within the priesthood, it's a divisive issue, because there are some priests who are very much in support of women being ordained and others who are not. Again, do I think that allowing women to be ordained would mean that people would suddenly be trampling to get into seminaries? No, I don't. But yes, I absolutely do think that women should be ordained. I do not understand the shutting down of conversations, and I would really love to see the conversation properly being opened up again.
I think so. And I think certainly if we look at Jesus's attitude to women, that he really empowered them and he really championed them and put them in significant places within his ministry and within his work. But, you know, you can see that the Bible it says very contradictory things about a woman's place.
Absolutely.
Sometimes it says to be silent in church, that a woman should be silent and submit to her husband. And in other times it says that there is no male, there is no female, and they're all one in Christ. So I think the conversation needs to be had without fear. I think you're right. And I think while we're talking about women, you've mentioned Mary, the mother of Jesus, a few times. And I'd like to just talk to you about your beliefs about her. I mean, particularly as she's your namesake as well. And the place of her in your life.
In my life, I suppose, we Catholics, we're interesting, I think, about Mary. You know, there's a very, very strong devotional side to our thoughts and belief in Mary. But there's also a strong theological side to things. She's not actually mentioned as much as you'd like her to, or at least maybe not as much as I'd like her to be mentioned in the Bible. And I just think she's phenomenal. You know, this young girl, this teenager is, you know, visited, however you want to interpret it, that by an angel, told she's going to have a baby, you know, essentially asked if she'll do this, agrees to it, has to go through all kinds of, I would imagine, shaming as a young, unmarried teenage mother, you know, pregnant teenage girl, is very much a guiding light in Christ's life. Seems, when you look at it in scripture, seems to prompt the first miracle that we see written about it in the wedding at Cana. You know, it's Mary who's kind of prompting him to perform the miracle. And I think she's like a lot of mammies in that regard. You know, we push the child to do the right thing. And I've always felt very comfortable praying to her. And I view her as a mother. I view her as extremely important in the Christian story. And I view her as so much more than simply, you know, kind of a side act or, you know, just a part of the story. She is absolutely at the heart of what happened. You know, if you didn't have Mary, you wouldn't have Jesus. That's incredible. She fascinates me. Just when I think about her whole story and her whole life really, really intrigues me.
I think she's an amazing role model. And I think that it makes sense, because it is nearly Christmas and we are talking about Mary, to focus in on this incarnation. And I'd love to ask you what Christmas means to you.
Well, Christmas it's been my favourite time of year since I was a child. And actually today we put up the tree. And today was the first year where my children cooperated without, you know, nearly killing each other, which was great. So that's nice. It is, I think, it's a time for reflection. It's a time for family. It is a time for working hard to set aside maybe ill feeling. It's a prime time to forgive if you can, or to think maybe about forgiving. You know, if there's something going on in your life and there's, you know, a falling out, oftentimes I think Christmas can be a time to maybe at least start the conversation towards reconciliation. So I think it's a really beautiful time. And I think it's a time where we learn a lot about putting others first. You know, people talk about how, you know, it's better to give than to receive, and it becomes almost trite, but that's not actually trite. You know, it is wonderful to be able to give And so I think, the emphasis at Christmas on giving, on charity, on love of others is really, really something quite special and quite magical.
That's such a lovely answer, and I think an inspiration to all of us. I want to slightly go a bit controversial, and I'd like to just talk about homosexuality, simply in the light that Pope Francis has just announced that he supports same-sex civil unions and says that homosexual people have the right to be in a family and that they are children of God. How has the Catholic community responded to that generally, and what are your personal thoughts?
Okay, so in terms of the general Catholic response, I'm always wary about giving kind of an umbrella response of any religious tradition. And I would say that there are very divided opinions on this within Catholics. So there are very, very many Catholics, obviously, who are gay or who have a gay family member and who love that family member dearly and who would like everyone else to see the unique individual that their family member is and to show this family member love. There are other Catholics who are very angry about what the Pope has said and who are very clearly anti-gay, and their comments are deeply hurtful. My own personal perspective is, and I'm going to quote Lady Gaga, that God makes no mistakes. So I think that, of course, a gay person belongs in a family. Of course, they are loved by God. In my view, every human being comes to us from God. So I don't understand the vitriol and I do not understand the hatred. And it seems to me deeply unnecessary. I can only imagine the hurt and the pain for the people who are members of the LGBTQ community, who want to be part of the Catholic Church, who, are maybe going to religious services or spending time with their families and feel unwelcome. I mean, that's just not acceptable. And as it happens, one of my brothers is gay, and it's not a problem for me. And I know that he was very worried that it might be a problem for my parents, and it wasn't, and it isn't. And if anything, I think it probably brought us all a little bit closer because we learned to understand each other maybe a little bit better. In terms of what Francis had said, on the one hand, it's encouraging, because he's talking about God loving gay people, and that's great because there have been an awful lot of things written by the church and said by previous popes which don't sound like that. On the other hand, I think we need to not get too excited that there's suddenly going to be a great sea change within the official teaching of the church. He's talking about civil unions. He's not using the word marriage, and he's not saying anything at all about maybe a blessing in a church or I suppose a Christian recognition of that. And, there'll be lots of Catholics, if they're listening to this, will be very angry with what I'm saying now and would be quite happy to tell me that I'm not Catholic in the way I'm speaking. And that's okay. I'm encouraged by what he said, but I will wait and see the outcome. But my personal view is that there is no need for hatred or condemnation because of somebody's sexuality.
And I think that still comes back to compassion and kindness, and whether you are supportive of the LGBTQ plus community or you have your own personal issues with them. I think that everyone would agree to treat people with kindness and to treat people compassionately. Another sort of controversial issue that I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you is, how would you respond to criticisms of other Christian denominations that you focus too much on the death of Jesus and not the resurrection, and that if Jesus died for our sins, why Catholics are called to do penance?
I focus a lot on the death of Jesus. I would say, obviously, we talk about it. That's kind of important. You can't have the resurrection if he doesn't die first. But, within certainly the Catholicism that I've experienced, two major seasons are Christmas and Easter. Christmas is about the birth of a child. And, for me, and this is where I get kind of soppy, what's not to love about that? Easter, yes, it is about death, but ultimately, and this is where I suppose my optimism comes out again, but it's a message of hope because it's a message of resurrection, forgiveness, salvation. So I don't think that within Catholicism we are morbidly obsessed with Christ's death. If anything, we are inspired by the resurrection, if that makes sense. The penance one, well, that's an interesting one. And, on the one hand, of course, we Catholics believe that, Jesus did die for our sins. But, we still have free will. And unfortunately, we still have the ability to cause pain and hurt and suffering to others. For Catholics, you can't say to someone, who you've caused pain or hurt or suffering to, I don't really need to apologize or atone or make things up with you because Jesus already forgave me. I mean, that's no wave. So I suppose it's about the balance of, we still have to live in the here and now. Okay, so we believe Jesus has saved us. And yet we also believe that we have a responsibility to live well and to try to live as he taught us. We have a responsibility to try and maintain our relationship with God and to maintain our relationship with others. We accept that we're imperfect, but we have this incredible opportunity to be forgiven if we seek forgiveness. And penance doesn't have to be this horrible, frightening thing. Penance is something that many people who are not Catholics do as well. If you hurt somebody or you cause pain and suffering to someone you love, often part of the way to being reconciled is to say, well, what can I do to make this up to you? And you might be told, well, you can't. Or you might be told, well, actually, next time you can drive me to such a place, or whatever it is. So I don't think it's as doom and gloomy as maybe it's seen outside of my interpretation of Catholicism.
Mary, thank you. That was such a fascinating answer, and I think it's helped me to...
Sorry, a bit of a Mary Poppins.
No, it's wonderful, and really helped me to understand something that I've maybe misunderstood in the past. So I really appreciate that answer. Thank you. Just as we close, there's just a couple of questions I'd like to ask you. And first of all is just about what you think Catholicism has to offer the 21st century world.
I think that, and unfortunately this isn't terribly well known, that there's a fantastic aspect of Catholicism called Catholic social teaching. And what that whole area of Catholicism does is it focuses on the importance of love of neighbour, and it does so by seeking an option for the poor, by calling for solidarity amongst people, by focusing on the dignity of the human person and really, really emphasising the need for justice and for actively working towards justice. So I think there's a really, really strong drive towards social justice and charity within Catholicism that I think is still incredibly important. I think there is a really fantastic emphasis on our responsibility, our moral responsibility towards others. And I think that's positive. I don't think that's a depressing thought. And I think the idea of forgiveness, being willing to forgive, being brave enough to seek forgiveness, and thereby, experiencing the absolute joy of repairing relationships or trying to repair relationships is really important. So I think these are all things, and they're rooted in gospel values that the Catholic faith can still offer in the 21st century.
And it's had such a strong history with those issues as well. And I'm thinking of the work that I've looked into of liberation theology and people like Oscar Romero and, outstanding figures and outstanding humans that have changed the world inspired by their Catholic faith. So, yeah, a wonderful message. And what final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with?
Oh, that one. Let me see. I suppose the first thing I would say is, to all your listeners, listening to me talk, don't take my views as representative of every single Catholic in every part of the world. I'm just one person who identifies as a Catholic, and these are my, I suppose, very personal responses to my take on my faith. At a broader level, I would say to all of your listeners that it's really important to try very hard not to make assumptions about a person simply because you hear the name of what their worldview is. I would say that wherever it's possible, to sit down with someone, talk to them, ask questions, listen, and you'll get to know them and you'll find out things about them that your assumptions wouldn't have let you see. So that's the message I suppose I'd like to say, is just be mindful of your assumptions, and if in doubt, ask.
Mary, what a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being part of the R.E. podcast today.
Oh, not at all. And thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed it. And I hope that my responses are of help to your listeners. It's been really, really fun.
Thank you. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the R.E. podcast. The podcast for those of you who think R.E. is boring, which it is. I've just proved it to you. Thank you so much for listening to me bore the life out of you.